Usually when you think of model trains, it's realistic layouts and double O-gauge sized trains. Then the other day I came across this, a T-gauge train, called so because the rails are 3mm apart. This thing is really tiny. I've built a few coffee tables in the past, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool to make a coffee table with a built-in tiny train? First steps were to mill rough Iroko boards and chop them down ready for gluing to squares that will form each layer of the table. Traditional train layouts go for realism with grass and trees, but I wanted to try something a bit different and go for all wood. So I cut out a rough shape with some polystyrene and then went to the computer to produce a CAD model. I'd not used Blender before, and it was a bit of a learning curve figuring out how to produce a rough shape and then sculpt some hills into it to produce a valley. Once the design was complete, it was exported and loaded into the CNC machine. A roughing pass was done first to take out the majority of the material. A bullnose bit was then swapped in to carve out the rest of the details. The track would sit on a separate layer beneath the valley, so the bottom needed to be cut out. To prevent the slope being sharp and weak at the bottom, the edges were cut back and sanded smooth. A spare bit of track gave a first glimpse of how the valley might look. A piece of plywood was cut to the same shape as the table, and then the valley was used to trace out the shape of the track onto the wood. With the valley position known and the crossover in hand, the route of the rest of the track could be worked out. A photo of this was taken and it was transferred into Fusion 360 and used as a guide for the digital model, which would dictate where the track would go. The channel which follows the valley was the 2mm cork sheet, which should help minimise noise. Here I'm testing the levels of the crossover and the joining track. The track coming off it needed to be perfectly level as it went down a slope and round a curve. I ended up raising up the crossover by about 1mm in the CAD model to try and help here, but a bit of foreshadowing, I did not get it spot on. With the design sorted, the track layer was then cut out for real. A downcut bit was used first to give a nice clean edge along the top, when an upcut bit used to hug out the majority of the material underneath. The holes for the controller, magnets, hinges and wires were all cut out, as well as the route for the track. So I've got the track bed cut out and sanded back, so now we've got to work on the side bits. I've done this test piece where you can see I've got an epoxy window which is going to basically go on the side of here, so you'll be able to see the trains going behind it. On the test piece I just used sellotape as the backing, and you can kind of see it's got some rippling where the tape surface affected it. So what I've done is ordered this piece of HDPE, and I'm going to cut this up and hopefully that'll give a nice smooth backing and a really clear surface. There was quite a few scratches and little imperfections on the sheet itself, so that's not ideal, but we'll see how it goes. Clear silicone was used to glue the forms into place and would stop the epoxy from leaking out. got the 3 dams in place now. You can see the channel where the epoxy is going to go in. I'm going to leave this overnight to dry and then do some epoxying tomorrow. I thought applying an initial layer of epoxy with a brush would seal up any leak holes and prevent bubbles. So I left it a few hours where it was still slightly tacky, and then the main pour was done. So I've got most of the silicone off now, and you can really see how it looks along this top edge. Overall, pretty good. Obviously I've over poured the top quite a bit, so that's going to have to be cut down on the CNC to make it the same height. The reason I did that is because you always get a bit of a uneven top where it lips up either side. So I just wanted to make sure I had enough material on the top to be able to cut that off. I've had a bit of a leak just there at the bottom, but that's the only epoxy leak we've had on the whole thing. Didn't go too far, so that's not so bad. And then there's some minor staining from the silicone on the wood, but that's all going to get sanded out anyway, I think, so it's not looking too bad. Next it was on to cutting the bottom piece. I had various channels cut into the top of it, which matched up with wire drops from above. Also had a large pocket in the middle where the controller and wiring would sit, along with another pocket where the USB power bank would go. With the top sides of the 3 layers done, the undersides also needed doing. Starting off with the middle layer, it was flipped over and pushed into a fixture which held the piece tightly. Also had a known origin point to ensure the top side and bottom cuts matched up perfectly. Next, the underside of the bottom was done, with recesses and holes cut out for the legs, along with a lip for the power bank cover. The most tricky cut was saved for last. Space was needed above the crossover for the train to pass through, but there wasn't much material in that section. Once milled out, the centre would only be supported by a really thin piece of wood and would be very weak. A pocket was needed in the middle of the board to give clearance for the controller, so the middle was glued down and that cut was done first. The middle pocket wasn't particularly well supported during the cut, and I noticed it moving a little bit, so I ended up holding it down with my hand, which I wouldn't recommend, but being careful, it was okay. Then it could be taken off and secured back down without any glue holding the middle section down to make it easier to remove once the thick neck had been milled down. There were going to be LED lights above the windows on the sides of the piece, so the channels for those were put in along with those for the cables. Last thing to cut was a channel around the base of a valley and some little holes where some streetlights were going to go in. I hit a bit of a snag while cutting the headroom for the clearance on one of the tunnels going off the side of a crossover. It was milling down and I thought, this is getting awfully close to the contours of the valley beneath, so I stopped it because I didn't want it crashing through the wall of a valley and looking rubbish. So now I need to think about what to do next. Before things were glued together, a quick test was done to make sure the cables could be run properly and also the hinges work well. The glue up went pretty well, thankfully. The next thing I'm going to do is clamp the top to the bottom and then give all sides a good sanding. This should also bring the level of the epoxy down so everything's flush. The sanding had exposed a few bubbles. Perhaps my epoxy prep with a paintbrush hadn't been such a good idea after all. Anyway, they were filled in with UV cure epoxy and resanded. I used a small chisel to smooth out the layer marks from the aborted CNC cut. Didn't know at this point, but I'd end up having to revisit that. So I've got the top valley here with the undulations that you can see pretty well from this angle, but I'm worried that once you put a bit of epoxy over the top, you're going to lose a bit of that definition. There's a little test piece I did, and you can kind of see through. It's not quite as clear, so what I'm going to do, I think, for better for worse, is get the blowtorch out and add a bit of contrast to the sides just by char grilling it selectively. So let's hope this works and doesn't look rubbish. The shape of a track bed was traced out and then used to cut the cork sheet to fit in the channel. It took a few goes to get everything to fit nice and tightly. On to track laying finally. I've been looking forward to this moment. The bulk of his CNC work was done and it felt like real progress would be made here. The crossover was nailed down as the bottom was too irregular for a decent glue joint. I started off with a small piece of track and it all went pleasingly well at first. First test fitting, then gluing down with water activated Gorilla Glue and nailing in. Next, a longer piece of track was needed. You'd think being flexi-track it would curve quite easily, but it really doesn't, and you have to work each rail against the other one while minimising stress, otherwise the rails just pop out the sleepers and junk the entire section. I messed up a bit here. I cut the track roughly to length, masked off the surrounding area to protect against accidental glue stains, and positioned for the final rail cut. It looked perfectly lined up with the rails and the crossover, and so I made the cut. Then the next second, one rail is way too short, the glue was starting to dry, and in a panic I stopped recording, hacked a small section of the track back and put another section in which was long enough with a joiner. There's an extra joint now, but it's not the end of the world, I guess. Finish was now applied to the tunnels along the sides and the front, as we wouldn't get another chance before the track went down. I'd added 4 electrical connections to the track, probably overkill, but better to have too many than too few. The technique for soldering this to the tiny steel track was to set the soldering iron stupidly hot, add flux to everything, and then push the pre-tinned wire onto the rail and apply the heat. This worked well, but I think I probably ruined the tip. The excess solder could then be cut off and sanded down. The rear track was then laid. I had some troubles with this, as the track came off a crossover arching up before it dropped back down again. The train really didn't like this, and so I ended up raising the track on the down ramps with 1mm pieces of cork, which solved the issue. It turned out that raising the down ramps up meant the train hit the top of a tunnel where I'd stopped the CNC cut. I ended up having to really carefully chisel down to generate enough clearance, so I could have just let the CNC do it after all. The next piece went in pretty well, despite it being really fiddly to get the drill in to pre-drill for the screws and nails which held down the track. I've not been filming all that much during the track laying because I've been really struggling with it, to be honest. Managed to get it around pretty far, in fact I managed to get it all the way, but I ran into a problem up here where the track came away from the sleepers, which meant I had to take it off again. I've only got a certain amount of these tiny screws which I've been using, which are great because you can drill the hole, pop them in and it holds them temporarily in place. but I've only got 6 and they're in use in other places. So as I've been going along, I've been replacing the screws with nails, and that went fine up until here. And basically I was able to pull the broken bit out of the track joiner, and I thought, oh great, I can get the new bit and push it back in. However, because we're down in this channel, when you put it in, it always goes in at an angle and ends up bending out one of the shoes a little bit. And I came to the conclusion I just wouldn't be able to do it in place. So I had to then somewhat desperately try and lever out the nails holding this little joiner in place. You can see the holes there at left, which meant cutting the track back a little bit, because when levering this out as well, I managed to break that bit of track. So yeah, it was pretty stressful, to be honest, and hit a bit of a low point last night. Anyway, I've slept on it, come back, and I'm going to give it another shot. I'm trying to connect the replacement bit of track in here, but after lowering it down, it likes to pop back out the fish plates. Connecting curved track in a trench is not easy. I managed to get it down eventually, and then I did what I should have probably done originally and ordered a big set of tiny screws off Amazon. When I was connecting the final bit of track into the crossover, somehow I still managed to cut it a little bit short, but the train still runs over it okay. The most problematic part is the crossover itself. It doesn't actually have an electrical continuity across the whole travel, so if the train goes over it slowly, its pickup wheels cut out when it goes over a plastic section and it stops. So to solve this, I just bought another train, so if one cuts out, the other pushes it over.
Yes.
Sanding the epoxy windows was next. I went up through all the grits and a polishing compound until it was clear. Afterwards I wasn't particularly happy with the result, as it was still a bit hazy, so I ordered some more targeted polishing attachments for a drill, and these helped a lot. As you can see, before and after. The last big job to do was an epoxy window over the valley. The valley sides were finished with hard wax oil, leaving about a centimetre at the top bare for the epoxy to bond to. Silicone was again used to form a barrier and stick the top to a sheet of melamine covered in tape, which the epoxy doesn't stick to. It was going to be really hard to get rid of bubbles when they were down in the valley, so when I mixed up my epoxy I spent way longer than usual degassing it. In fact, it bubbled up so much I had to transfer it to 2 different pots in the vacuum chamber. I used an oversized syringe to suck it up, which was pretty tough because it was so thick, but then it could be precisely delivered down into the hole in the valley without touching the sides. A thickness of about 5mm was aimed for. Then used a blowtorch to try and pop any bubbles. There was an area where I probably lingered with a blowtorch was slightly too long, and so it singed it and it went a bit cloudy, which isn't the best, but you don't notice it too badly. While the epoxy cured, I got on with other jobs, such as putting in magnets for various panels and installing the power button. As all of the CNC operations were done, the bottom could then be rounded over, my logo put on the back, and also a panel made which would hold the battery into the bottom. Threaded inserts were installed, which would allow the legs to be easily taken on and off. One thing that I hadn't considered when I was doing my design work for this was the need to be able to prop the top open when doing maintenance and accessing the train in the controller. So what I ended up doing was making an arm which could then have magnets at the top and bottom, which would then be able to kind of prop it open nicely. And then to store it, I put an extra couple of magnets on the bottom, which would enable the arm to snap to it. Now for the moment of truth. Had the top window worked? So it's all looking really good, apart from right dead centre bubble on the bottom. Can't believe it. The silicone was removed, which revealed a couple of spots which must have had some silicone squeeze out. They were topped up with UV epoxy, and you couldn't see them once polished. The bubble could actually be reached from the underside, so it was carefully filled with UV epoxy, and then the piece held upside down so the resin filled the bubble best, and it was set in place. Afterwards you could still see something there, but it was a lot less obvious than it was before. The excess epoxy was then surfaced off, going down about 0.2 of a millimetre at a time until the top was completely flat. A tiny layer of wood was also removed, which cleaned up the marks from the silicone. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to support the channel. The top was then rounded over and the camera had a bit of a fall. The sanding process was long and arduous. I actually did it twice as well, as I wasn't happy with the result the first time around. Using a random orbital sander to 800 grit and then wet sanding by hand to 3000 gave the best results. It was then polished using epoxy polishing compound. Not a fun process. I added magnets to the front of the table, so when it closed it did so really firmly and there weren't any gaps. It also gave the opening arm something to join onto. I think these concealed hinges were meant for cupboard doors, but they work quite well in this case. They do wobble a little bit, but 3 of them give plenty of strength. This is the big blue controller, and it's too big actually. So I took it apart, and with an AA battery holder delete, the bottom could be completely swapped out for a 3D printed slimline version. Wires were also soldered internally, to avoid having to plug in bulky cable connectors to the sides. I needed some spacers to bring the controller top surface up to that of the wood, so a quick bit of milling and chopping later, I had them. I also reprinted the bottom of the controller to give tabs I could screw down into the spacers. This was a test of using grout as ballast for the track. Besides the colour being wrong and the bleed out into the wood, I decided that I didn't really like the look anyway. So the wood around the track was finished as normal, going right up to the track edge, but being careful not to get any on the rails. The cover that fits around the controller was cut out, and it was used as a guide to glue in the controller spaces, using wood glue and a bit of super glue for instant clamping. It was on to wiring next. This included attaching all of the wires from the track together, including the power button, and lastly a couple of PWM lighting controllers were taken apart and had 3D printed supports made so they could be screwed into the underside of the cover. LED strips went into the recesses and the wires run along channels to route them to the dimmer. Tiny screws were used to secure the cables in place. top was then finally secured to the base. Blunt tip needles were perfect as little lampposts. As they were hollow, wires could be run down the centre of them. First they were sanded, and then cut to size and coloured black. The lights themselves are surface meant LEDs that have tiny wires pre-soldered to them. They're small enough to fit through the hole in the lamppost. There's a link to them in the video description. I needed to attach a 100 ohm resistor to each of them. 1 6-watt resistors were the smallest non-surface mount I could find. To get to bare metal, a flame burnt the coating off a wire and a bit of sandpaper removed the residue. A bend was made at the top of the wire near the light, so after it was pushed into the hole, it would be easy to rebend into a good position. Each of the 7 street lamps were then soldered up and the wires hot glued in place. There's a couple of reasons for the hairpin legs. The good reason is I wanted minimal attention drawn to the legs, so as not to distract from the top. The truer reason is I'd already spent so long on this project, so I just really didn't want to make legs. I know I already had these. That said, I quite like how they look with this piece. All that was left was to plug in the battery and somewhat awkwardly turn it over.